Liverpool was a tough place to grow up. I think it still is, but I think it was tougher then, just after the war. The Beatles are all war babies, and Liverpool was very badly damaged in the war. So when they grew up, their playgrounds were bomb sites, and quite often, for the most part really, these remained unimproved for a very long time, right up until the time they left the city and became world famous 20 years later. It was still full of bomb sites. In fact, when I first went there in the late 70s, it's still full of bomb sites. And it was a tough place. There were gangs and, it wasn't the only tough place in the world, but it was certainly a tough one. I mean, you could be beaten up by people who lived across the street because you lived on that side of the street and they lived on the other. So they had to be able to take care of themselves. And in a thousand ways through this book, you see how the Beatles were able to take care of themselves. And this was amongst their armory when they became the biggest celebrities the world had ever known, and everyone wanted a piece of them, and they had to really survive that period.
Their sense of humour is apparent, and also you can see how that comes from growing up in Liverpool. The sign, for example, in the fish and chip shop after the war, "Due to Hitler, our portions are littler."
Yes. I mean, Liverpool was, as I said, very badly damaged, but the people could never be bombed out of existence. They, as long as they could cling to life, they would always have a joke. I mean, the word in Liverpool is that if you get beaten up by someone or mugged by someone, they'll tell you a joke before they run away. And the Beatles all do had a tremendous sense of humour, and part of their appeal when they broke through, I mean, the music was obviously what reached people first, but then once they had the ear of people, they were very, very funny. And you can look on YouTube to this day and see so many examples of their humour. And I, for one, still find it funny now. Even though I know what's coming next, I still find them funny.
Funny and also enormously resilient. There's George, who later would famously become the kind of peacenik and follow the guru to India. Here he is administering the odd headbutt.
Yep, they did. There's a nice story, when not nice for the recipient of it, obviously, who was butted. Terrible thing to suffer. But yeah, Paul McCartney tells this story of introducing George to someone in the school playground one day, and George just nutted him. And there's a quote from John that he tried to nut someone once, and the guy moved, and he almost split his head open. And Ringo tells a story of how his granddad threatened to nut him if he misbehaved. So yeah, a tough place to grow up. But like I said, all this stuff went into their armory, and they knew how to protect themselves.
Because the notion is, sort of looking back through rock, that the Rolling Stones were the wild ones and the Beatles were the clean-cut ones. Well, you get exactly the opposite feeling from this book, that the Beatles were tough.
Yeah, beware of easy cliches, I think, generally. I mean, in life, apart from in the Beatles and the Rolling Stones story. But most of the myths about the Stones and the Beatles and the way they related to one another and who was tough and who wasn't tough are just that, myths. The Stones were grammar school boys, art school boys, just like the Beatles were. The thing that they had in common, well, they had many things in common, but they were bright, all of them. They all could see their way through a very difficult period in the 60s when, as much as one might imagine all that adulation was fantastic, it obviously came with a lot of pressure, and they all dealt with it intelligently because they were intelligent guys.
I mean, these guys, the Beatles, they were all headed, possibly, except for John Lennon, they were really headed for jobs in factories and so forth. Maybe Paul McCartney was looking at management, but, music saved them, didn't it?
Yes, John, goodness knows what John Lennon would have done. He made this statement in 1958 to a friend of his from art school called Tony Carricker, that he was never going to work for a living. He was never going to get a job, a 9-to-5 job. And he had a word for anyone who did laborious jobs. He called it Brahma striving. And he was never going to be a Brahma striver, but goodness knows what he would have done had the Beatles not worked. And the fact that they did actually end up making a living from doing what they really wanted to do owed to so many other factors, including a lot of sheer luck. No doubt they had the talent too, but I mean the lucky breaks came one after another for them. And in that respect, he was saved from something that a fate worse than death, I think, in his position. Paul McCartney, his father wanted him to be a teacher. His mother hoped he would be a doctor. He was a bright boy. And he was going to be, I think, a teacher, in that he was probably going to go and enroll on a teacher training course when the Beatles saved him. George and Ringo had manual jobs. Not that they weren't capable of more, but that seemed to be what the future held for them. But they all had this thing that they were going to hold out for this career in music as long as they possibly could. And whilst all around them, adults were telling them to get a proper job, son, they held out for something they believed in that seemed so unlikely, and yet ultimately it paid off.
Lennon did buckle under for, what, 6 weeks and took a labouring job.
That's a great story in the book. I didn't really know much about this. This same guy I mentioned a minute or two ago, Tony Carricker, his father was a foreman on a building site, and in 1959, when John Lennon wanted a new guitar, and crucially his mother, who might have bought it for him, was now dead because she had been run over by a car in the previous year, 58. John wanted this new guitar, and his Aunt Mimi said, if you want it, you've got to earn it. So amazingly, John Lennon, who was not in any way, shape or form ever cut out for physical labour, spent 6 weeks working on a building site with a pickaxe in his hand, hating every second of it, until eventually he was fired, but he was fired with enough money to put down a deposit on a new guitar. And that was his Club 40, or the Club Footy, as he called it,
Yeah.
which was his first electric guitar. And he was using that when the Beatles first went to Hamburg.
One of the other facts that becomes apparent very early on is how each of them, how they're so obsessed by music, it comes out in various forms. There's George, for example, sketching guitars in a school exercise book.
Yeah, that's right. And he kept those exercise books all his life. And if you look in the book of the Living in the Material World film that came out a couple of years ago, there are illustrations there from his school exercise books in which he's clearly paying no attention whatever to the teacher and simply sketching Fender Stratocasters in the back of the class. One of Paul McCartney's best friends, probably his best friend before he met John Lennon, was a guy called Ian James, who taught him to play the guitar. And he says that once Paul discovered Little Richard and found that he could do that Little Richard voice, it would come bursting out of him at the most unexpected moments, as if Little Richard was somehow trapped inside him and needed to every once in a while escape for air. You know, he would just burst into Long Tall Sally in the middle of the school playground or on a bus or whatever it might be. They really did consume this music, this American music that came over in 56, beginning, well, initially with Bill Haley and then really landing with Elvis. Made such an impact on them.
Yes, because England was a place, you paint a place of such grey torpor, and suddenly this vibrant, exciting music comes out of the United States, Chuck Berry, etc., and Buddy Holly, and they are just swept away with it.
Yeah, it did indeed, but it only appealed to their generation. It wasn't something that older people could get. I mean, it had that desired effect of both being incredibly thrilling to them and at the same time annoying all the adults that they liked. It was the perfect thing for a teenager. They were the first teenagers to be the beneficiaries of rock and roll, and they very much were the right age at the right time. They were 14, 15, 16, with pocket money and rebellion in their pockets when suddenly this music arrived, and it was hard to get. Everything these days is so easy. At the click of a mouse or the flick of a switch, you can hear pretty much anything you want. But in those days, it was really scarce, and they had to go looking for it. And that, in a way, kind of weeded out those who were only half interested. It left this strong core of connoisseurs who, when they found one another, could talk the talk about Chuck Berry or this chord or that melody or this hairstyle. And so it really was a precious commodity for them. Someone, again, I'm quoting now for the third time, Tony Carricker, said that early rock and roll enthusiasts would have found each other like drug takers do these days. You walk in a room and you kind of instantly know who the other might be. And they would find one another, and that was it. They had this in common from that point on.
And I suppose this was a time when it was helpful to live in Liverpool. It's a port town. It probably had people bringing in more records and sailors and so forth. Is that true?
It is true, and yet this is actually one of the many endearing myths about the Beatles, that they got their love of American music and their repertoire of American music from sailors who were plying the transatlantic route between Liverpool and New York, because actually they didn't. Some guys in Liverpool had a supply line of that kind. There are little instances in the Beatles story of this song or that particular moment coming via that route, but generally speaking the Beatles got their American repertoire from record shops, because the best of the American music was issued in Britain by British record labels under license and could be obtained not just in Liverpool but all over the country. But all the same, there is an element of truth to that, but it has been greatly exaggerated.
Who were the people that really fired them up, Mark?
Musically, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, well, to begin with, Bill Haley, no doubt Rock Around the Clock, which is an often overlooked track these days. And the received wisdom about Bill Haley is that, he was interesting until people realised that he was an old guy and no one then gave a fig anymore. But the reality is that Rock Around the Clock did really energise all four of them. But really it was Elvis who started it, Elvis in 1956. By the end of 57, they were seriously into Elvis, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Eddie Cochran, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Chuck Berry and Little Richard. That was the core. But their tastes were very broad, actually. And although these were the guys they really loved, if there was a track by somebody else that really got their imagination, that was fine. They kept an open mind to all the possibilities. And not so much English stuff, because English rock and roll was ersatz. It was copy. It was never had the right echo on it, and didn't ever get past these guys who were into the authentic material. But they did have influences by all styles of other music, because growing up in England in those days, which didn't have a dedicated rock radio station at that time, much like New Zealand, I'm sure, they would hear all sorts of music on the radio, and all of that kind of drip fed into their influences as well.
I'm talking to Mark Lewisohn, author of The Beatles Tune In. Mark, one of the things I love about the book is little incidental details. I had no idea that Cliff Richard was called Harry Webb.
Yeah, Harry Webb.
And that John Lennon actually liked his first single, I think.
Yeah, Move It was the first British rock and roll record that really kind of cut the mustard. And they didn't like many other Cliff Richard records, but this was where he began. Cliff Richard, Move It was his first record. And it really, it's still a great record to this day. It is an authentic piece of English rock and roll, and there weren't many of them from that late 50s period. Actually, another thing that I found interesting is to see that John Lennon is 5 days older than Cliff Richard. And Cliff Richard was a star for almost 5 years before John Lennon. And this is actually a vital difference, because before the Beatles, you had to be kind of like 16, 17, 18 to make it. One of the things that John Lennon felt, and I've quoted him in this book saying it, was that when the Beatles kept getting turned down and it looked like they weren't going to get a recording contract and ever become famous, he felt they were too old. He was already by this point 22 years old, and surely that was too old to make it, because the example with Cliff was that you would be 18 and get discovered. So the fact that they were older when they made it again gave them a much better grounding to survive it. They had lots of experience when they made it.
You pinpoint various points when the Beatles... You see, we assume now, because the Beatles are so famous and they're so omnipresent for the last 50 years, we assume it was inevitable. It was predestined they would be famous. But what this book does is very quickly disabuse us of this notion.
They had the talent, and they always had the belief in themselves, although there was also a strange vulnerability at play sometimes. But generally speaking, they were pretty bolshy with their talent. They knew they were good, and they knew it for good reason, because they were having quite an effect on audiences all the time. But they still had to get their foot in the door of the places that really counted, where they could get their sound across to people, like radio studios, TV studios, and in particular record companies. And they had a hell of a job. They were actually too original for their own good to begin with, in the sense that because they were doing something that people didn't really know about, no one actually was looking for it, if you like.
There was
Star
no
Squad.
blueprint, was there? I mean, they were making it.
Yeah.
They were telling us or showing us what a rock group might become.
Oh, you're so right. You're so right, Richard. It was a real shock to me because I grew up with people hearing people say, "Oh, you know, the Beatles." I thought for a minute I thought they were just another group, and then I realised how good they were. And I sort of had this thing in mind that there were so many groups like the Beatles, and of course we've had 50 years of this rock band thing with guys on lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass guitar, drums. That you would think that was the case, but in fact they were pretty much the first. Every band that we've had for the last 50 years owes so much to the Beatles. Whether or not they like the Beatles, whether or not they feel they're influenced by them, they are treading the path that the Beatles first set down. Because before the Beatles, it was backing groups behind a lead singer, like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, and the Shadows' own records were purely instrumental. There was Shane Fenton and the Fentones' own records were purely instrumental. There was always that thing of someone and the somethings, and the idea of a group called the something that was entirely self-contained, where they one or two or three or even all four of them sing, and where they write their own songs often. This was original to the Beatles.
It sort of comes out, that newness, by the fact they seem to have so much trouble getting a name for themselves, i.e. naming themselves the Beatles. I think it takes 300 pages. Mark.
Yeah, just the fact that they were called the something was different, and an idea. And when I say that things were different about them, I'm not talking in an abstract sense. I'm actually, what I'm saying in essence is that they thought of it. So they kept thinking of things that other people hadn't done, which is the sign of true originality. And one of them in Liverpool, where there were so many groups called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cass and the Casanovas, and all those kind of groups, just to call themselves the was different. But when they got to London, everyone was telling them, you'll never make it with a name like that. Change your name or you'll never have success. I mean, it sounds so ludicrous now, but that was the thinking.
And there are various crises. Lennon comes back. First of all, actually, it's amazing now to look back and realise they played lunchtime gigs at the Cavern. They played lunchtimes.
What an extraordinary thing that is. Right there in the heart of Liverpool, in a cellar down 17 sticky steps off a very narrow little cobbled side street called Matthew Street, was this place where you could go and see the Beatles play for an hour. Actually, they did 2 one-hour sessions every lunchtime. Not every lunchtime, usually 2 or 3 lunchtimes a week. But whenever they did it, they would play 2 one-hour sessions. And it cost like £1 to get in, which was nothing. I mean, you remember the old money like I do, I expect.
Yes.
£1 to get in. And you could get... And the guy down there didn't sell alcohol because he didn't want to make money from intoxicating young people. I mean, this is all amazing now to think about that. And you could get a bowl of soup and a sandwich really cheaply and watch the Beatles for an hour, and they would take requests.
Yes.
You could shout out requests or hand up a piece of paper saying, please sing so-and-so for so-and-so. And you could almost reach out and touch them because they were that close. The Cavern stage wasn't even elevated, so it was level, pretty much level with the audience, and just by arm's reach from the front row. And they built this extraordinary rapport with their audience there. A very, very close relationship that was genuinely two-way. You know, they cared for their audience. And the young girls in the audience, they didn't take advantage of them. They were like big brothers to them, making sure they were okay and getting home okay after a gig and all that kind of stuff. Really quite an amazing relationship.
And then they go to Hamburg, and again, the pressure on them, it's relentless. Playing music like factory workers, they are just up there every night, sometimes, 5 or 6 hours.
It was the ultimate gig for a gang of young guys who are in this to basically play rock and roll, avoid real work and meet as many girls as they can. Hamburg provided all of that and lots of free drink thrown in on top. So, but ultimately it did wear thin for them. Each time they went to Hamburg, they would after a while be longing to get home because it was a bit too much, a bit unrelenting, the Hamburg experience.
And they got deported, didn't they, after the first
The first trip did end in something of disarray, yes. George was sent home because he was discovered to be underage. He was only 17, and you had to be 18 to even be in the clubs, let alone work on the stage. Paul and Pete were deported for allegedly trying to set fire to their lodgings, this very dingy couple of rooms they had in the back of an old cinema. And then John and Stuart were sent home. They weren't deported as such. They were just like, well, you go home now. And they arrived home in disarray, and it was one of a number of junctures in the story when it could have stopped at that point. John actually thought, do I really want to do this anymore, or should I go and do something else? And after a few days he decided he would carry on, and the band got back together. And from that point on, actually everything is a very, very steep upward trajectory.
But McCartney considers at that time too a factory job, doesn't he? Considers management, and Lennon has to deliver an ultimatum to him, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah, Paul's dad at the end of this first Hamburg trip said to him, okay, you've given up, because Paul gave up his education to go and play in Hamburg, and when he comes back there's no immediate prospect that things are going to be okay, and his dad says, well, you've got to go and get a job. And I mean, he didn't earn a lot of money, Jim McCartney, Paul's dad, and the mum had died, Paul's mum, and there were two boys growing up there, Paul and his brother Mike, and Jim said, off you go and get a job, son. And instead of getting a job that was suited to his academic qualifications, because Paul was an exam achiever, he went out and got a factory job. And he was working in this factory when the Beatles were first started to play the Cavern. And John and George literally had to come to the factory and said, you're going to play with us or not. And he did on that occasion. But actually, amazingly, there are quotes from Paul McCartney saying he was really thinking that he might become executive material at this factory if he stuck at it, and was considering giving the Beatles up. And as you say, John Lennon had to give him a proper ultimatum. Either you're playing today or you're out. And Paul turned up and went on stage, and that was the end of the factory job. And it was, the thing is, you see, we're so accustomed to thinking of these guys as legends. Awful word that is overused far too much these days. They're not. They were just guys. They were just people who had decisions about their own lives to make. And if in accepting John's ultimatum, Paul was rebelling against his father in a way that was bigger than he'd ever done before, and was therefore for him in his life a big moment, to really, really rebel against his dad like that. And it was a decision that he had to take. It sounds so obvious now, but for a moment there he had to think about it.
There are many memorable characters in the book, and I guess I'm thinking Brian Epstein absolutely bursts into the book. We'll come to him in a minute. But probably one of the quieter people is Pete Best, the drummer, because Ringo's not even in the band at this stage that we're talking about, is he?
No, he's not in the band, but he is in the book. I got tired of other Beatle books where they tell the Beatles story and then suddenly Ringo joins in 1962 and you get a little bit of his back history, but not much. And then he's in the group, and that always sells him short. And his story is actually as compelling as any of them. In fact, even more so, some would say.
Yeah, because the fact he survived his childhood is quite something. He was very sick, wasn't he?
He had a very traumatic childhood indeed. He was an only child who suffered greatly with ill health. He very nearly died 3 times at the age of 7. His mother was told he wouldn't last the night. Poor woman had to get the bus home from hospital and just expect never to see her boy again. But he was always a tough-minded little kid, Ringo. Physically not so, but mentally very much so. It still is. And he hung in there, and he then had another major illness when he was 14. The consequence of all this being that he was quite physically weak, and also he missed so much of his education. He missed a good 2.5 years of school. And though he's a naturally intelligent guy, Ringo, or Richie as he was when all these events were going on, there are certain things that he lacked, like, an ability to spell, for example. And maths is a little bit beyond him, or at least was. I don't know how it is these days. But he was a tough little kid, Ringo, and he hung in there, and he was intent on making drums his living. And in the most unlikely of circumstances, from this very sickly childhood and amidst great poverty, he became one of the most famous young men in the world.
His moment of his music obsession coming to the fore is when he's mooning at the set of drums in the shop window.
Yes. Well, it depends what you mean by mooning. Do you mean
Well, he's longing for. You can see he's got no money. He's skint.
Yeah.
He's a kid,
Yeah.
and he's looking at these drums, thinking, "Oh, longingly," I guess is the word I'm after.
Longing, yeah, absolutely. And the price is beyond him, but he ends up, by just one of those extraordinary things, he ends up playing drums for the first time, or at least beating a drum for the first time in hospital, when he's in hospital for about a year and a half with tuberculosis. And yeah, he comes out, and his stepfather buys him a second-hand drum kit, and he joins a group, and that's it. You know, he's away and intent on doing this for as long as possible.
Every time he runs across the Beatles, it's apparent they get on. Ringo gets on with the other three, and they have a real natural chemistry of humour and a love of music. Yet Pete Best is there, and he seems the odd one out, the guy who is the drummer.
Yeah, for 50 years, those who follow the Beatles story have been pondering the question, why did the Beatles sack Pete Best? As if there's this great mystery about it, that, you know, there must be more to it than we know. But actually what we know, when you really, really look at it, what we know more than adds up to enough, and was indeed the reasons why he was sacked. And it's twofold. And one is that John, Paul and George never considered him good enough as their drummer. It's certainly nowhere near as good as Ringo, but from their point of view, just never the right guy. And secondly was his personality. He was very, very quiet. They were very ebullient. He drummed with his head down most of the time, not making any eye contact. And if you've ever been in a band, you will know, anyone listening to this who's been in a band will know that when the chemistry is wrong, you know it. And when the chemistry is right, you know it. You make beautiful music when the chemistry is right, and it's never quite the same when the chemistry is wrong. And with Pete, it was just a pragmatic thing. They grabbed him because if without him they couldn't have got the gig in Hamburg. So they grabbed him and off they went. He was a beginner. They found out while he was there that he wasn't very good. They encouraged him to find a particular style, which he stuck at, and in that style he was okay. 4 in the bar, boom, 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 all through the night. But the Beatles were always very musically versatile, and as soon as they were trying other things, they found him wanting, and that never changed. Ringo, whenever they played with him, it swung.
Stu Sutcliffe, the other character who is part of the early Beatles story, he did bring a lot to the band, even if it wasn't music.
Yeah, he too was a beginner on bass guitar when they got him, but he eventually became okay, not brilliant, but not too bad. But he brought them something else, which was an artistic ingredient that was vital to their development. And in particular, when they were in Hamburg, it was through Stuart that they attracted the attention of 3 young, cool German people who gave the Beatles a lot artistically. So when Stuart left the Beatles, he left in June '61 at the end of their second trip to Hamburg. He stayed in Hamburg when they returned to Liverpool, and he was out of the group then. He had given them a great deal. The tragedy about Stuart is that within a year of him leaving the Beatles, he would be dead of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 21, which is really quite an appalling thing.
And that really, I mean, John Lennon, you make the point in the book, it becomes apparent that John Lennon, who is the natural leader of the Beatles, looks up to Stuart Sutcliffe, and he is devastated. Again.
Yeah, that's it. That is it. John didn't look up to many people. He respected many people in the sense of if they stood up to him, he would respect them, and he would respect whatever people brought to the party. But there was something about Stuart and their friendship that was particularly important to John. And for Stuart to die at the age of 21, only 3.5 years after John had lost his mother in a car accident when she was only 44 and he was only 17, and he'd lost his uncle George as well, who was like his father figure through most of John's childhood. These all had a great effect on John. And the same will be true in 1967 when Brian Epstein died at the age of 32. Again, John lost someone who was very, very important to him far, far too early.
Brian Epstein, he comes bursting into this book. I hadn't really appreciated what a troubled, conflicted, brilliant man he was.
Yes, yes, all of that. You've got three very good adjectives to describe him there. He was all of those things. And what he brought to the Beatles as their manager, particularly in the first year and a bit, which is in this book. This book cuts off at the end of 1962, when the Beatles were on the very, very cusp of their great breakthrough. What he's brought to them to bring them to that point in the 13 months he's been their manager to that point is really quite phenomenal. They were so disorganized without him. And indeed, they were actually planning or thinking of breaking up just before he came along.
They were really
So
stymied, weren't they, Mark?
they were.
They couldn't figure out how to break out beyond Liverpool, even though they were enormously popular.
Yeah, this is the extraordinary thing about the Beatles. I mean, so many ingredients made them great. And another one is that they had this desire always to move on. If they were ever stuck in the same place or having to do something more than once, they would get bored very quickly. They were the biggest group in Liverpool, which, okay, they were only known to young people. This music was still very much the music of young people only. It wasn't even covered in the local newspapers at all. But there was a strong rock and roll scene there for the young people, and the Beatles were undoubtedly kings of the scene. Whereas that might have been enough for any other group, and they would have just carried on doing it for as long as they possibly could, the Beatles got bored of being number one because there were no fresh challenges for them. They played all the venues. They got the most money that anybody got. They couldn't earn any more because they were already at maximum. No one would pay them anymore. So where would they go next? And through that lack of a challenge, they were considering breaking up. I mean, that is how brave and original these guys were. And it's that same attitude that carried them right through the 60s of finding a winning formula and ditching it for another one that might not work, and yet then found that it did. And that was the pattern they always repeated in the 60s. Brian comes along and Brian keeps them together, presents them with fresh challenges, gets them out of Liverpool, gets them a recording contract, doesn't try to change them in any material way, certainly not any way that they weren't prepared to be changed.
But he does change their image, though, doesn't he, substantially?
All he does is tidy them up a little bit. They've still got the same attitude, they've still got the same arrogance, they've still got the same sense of humour on stage, they've still got the same talent. All he's done is make them more visibly presentable so that they can get a foot in the door. I liken it to the wooden horse of Troy. They would never have got a recording contract if they hadn't slightly smartened up. But once they got inside Troy, once they were making records and they were having success, they could then dress however they liked.
So he got them out of the leathers into mohair suits, he got them the haircuts, and he got them to bow. That seemed to be a bit of an issue, bowing.
Well, bowing was, but it sounds deeply anachronistic these days, but it wasn't so those days. He didn't change their hairstyle, it was already there, and the myth that he got them out of the leathers and into the suits is very much wide of the truth, in that they wanted to do it too. He didn't force them. They wanted to make that change. They were ready to make that change. He suggested it. They saw the sense of it. They agreed to it. In fact, they helped design the suits. So there is this myth that is, and a kind of held against Brian, that, you know, he made them into pretty boys. This is all a nonsense. He actually used images of them in the leather jackets, the leather trousers, for the first 3 months of his management. He even staged that photo session in which they were wearing the leathers. But he also knew the sense of it, which was that, you know, if they wanted to get inside Troy, they had to get out of those leathers and wear something that would at least be acceptable. They saw the sense of that and they made the change. The thing about the Beatles is that they were very, 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 and you could add a few more varies on top of that if you like, strong-willed, opinionated guys. No one could make them do anything unless they really saw the sense of it and agreed to it. The idea that he could come along and railroad these guys into doing something against their wishes is nonsense, and anyone who suggests such a thing doesn't understand the Beatles.
And Brian Epstein himself is a very risky character. Here he is, on one hand, he's running his record store in Liverpool very successfully, yet he's got this other life. He's a gay man in a country where homosexuality is still illegal.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. He was a risk taker always, and I think they saw that in him, John in particular. You said earlier that John was the leader of the Beatles, and some people might listen to that and think, well, yeah, I preferred Paul, or I preferred George, or I preferred Ringo, or, surely Paul was the most important one. He wrote this song or that song. The reality is that the Beatles were a band, and in a band, which is a collective of four people, you're going to have a hierarchy. And the Beatles were always John Lennon's band. He started them and he led them, and the others looked up to him as the leader. And when I say that the Beatles appointed Brian as their manager, they all agreed to it, but the decision was John's. And John Lennon saw in Brian Epstein that he was a risk taker, because, as you say, there was this other side to Brian's life. He was, on the one hand, rich, or seemed to them to be rich anyway. He certainly had all the trappings of wealth. He was well dressed, well groomed. He had a car. He owned a shop. He lived in a nice house. So they looked up to him for that. But beyond that, there was an edge to Brian. He was arrogant. He was a risk taker. He was an original guy in his own way. He thought differently from other people. And he was a man in Liverpool who thought London. He had a London address book. No one else in Liverpool had such a thing.
And that would become vital, wouldn't it? Because he's the guy who gets out of Liverpool, goes to London, and eventually, after a few mishaps, he meets George Martin, who actually is not that impressed with the Beatles, is he?
No, well, that's another great story in this. Sorry, it sounds like I'm trumpeting my own book a bit too much, but in my book there are so many of these amazing stories, and one that came as a great shock to me, although I always knew something was afoot here, is that George Martin signed the Beatles before he saw them, and without liking the couple of tracks that he had heard. He basically was forced to sign them. That's how lucky we are to have the Beatles in our lives, and having changed our culture and our music for 50 years. Because even the guy who made all those records with them that had such an impact and still are having such an impact didn't really want to sign them. But owing to a succession of coincidences and good fortune, he did.
Including having an affair with his secretary. He was basically being punished, George Martin, wasn't he?
In a way, yes. I prefer to think of that in an alternative way, which is to say that it was because of his love for Judy and her love for him, and this love has now sustained for nearly 60 years through children and grandchildren, and I think possibly even great-grandchildren. Because of that love, the Beatles got their recording contract. But yes, there was this element where George's arm was twisted because the managing director of EMI was unhappy at George's personal behaviour. But what I say is thank goodness for it.
Yes. How did you dig out all these stories, Mark? Because, look, the book is wonderful in that it does refreshen the Beatles story. It made it vital again. Look, if I could be so daffy as to suggest that it even gave me back John Lennon and George Harrison. I feel them alive, and in this book, you just feel that you've resurrected them.
Thank you, Richard. I'm really pleased to hear you say that.
The welter of facts could have made it a very leaden narrative, but what it does is it puts us there beside them when they're writing these songs and when they're having these traumas. How did you get all this stuff?
Well, this is my subject. I've been writing about the Beatles professionally for more than 30 years now, and I am, I think, still the only full-time Beatles historian in the world. I actually do it for a job. It's not my hobby.
Can you believe you get to do this, Mark?
Well, I didn't tell it to the careers advisor at school when I was leaving. I was going to be a Beatles expert, but my life has just worked out that way. And of course, I'm really happy about that because I always had a passion for this subject. But the reality is that, well, I think that the word detail somehow, for some reason, become a bit of a dirty word for people. Oh, that book's got too much detail in. Detail can be a double-edged thing. It can, if it's not used properly, it can weigh a book down, if you like. As you say, you use the word leaden. It can have that effect. But my belief is that detail, if used correctly, can lift a story so much. It can give a story all the colour that it needs in order for the reader to find or to believe that he's actually there in the moment when it's happening. And I just love researching detail, and I love writing it in a way that I find engaging, and it seems to work, because detail is is where it's at. And if you've got a lot of detail, you don't need opinion so much. So this is not about me saying things. It's I found other people to say it for me, and they're moving the story along, and all I'm doing is weaving it, really.
It's a heck of a narrative, Mark, isn't it? I mean, these four boys who in another world have turned out to be factory workers, they literally take over the music world. They change. They make they begin to make the 60s.
They change everything. They change society even. I mean, they didn't set out to do any of this. They just set out to play Elvis Presley records. But at the end of the day, through a combination of events, circumstances, their own talent and so much else, and the kindness of other people as well, they end up having the most phenomenal impact on culture and society and music and people's lives. You know, they bring joy to people's lives, and they still are to this day. And my hope with this book was that it would be read, of course, by people who like the Beatles, but also for people who have never bought a book on the Beatles in their life and never thought they would. I'm hoping that they might come a point where they would think, hang on a minute, these guys have been around now for 50 years. They've been part of my life, whether I like it or not. Who were these people and how did it all happen? And it just so happens that the Beatles aren't only the biggest band of all time, they've got the best story of all time. They're pioneers in everything they do, and this story is mind-blowingly amazing in so many places.
And right to the end of these 962 pages, can you believe it's 962 pages?
Yes, I can.
The surprises, Love Me Do, George Martin doesn't like it.
Doesn't like it and doesn't want to put it out, but is kind of again forced to put it out, and it becomes such a success that his head is turned about what these guys are capable of. I said that George Martin was forced to sign them, and that's true, but the moment he met them, he liked them. Not Pete, who never said a word on the one and only occasion they met, but John, Paul and George. Their personalities impressed him very much, and he could see they were original. All he needed to do was get them the right song and they would have a success. And he found them a song called How Do You Do It and made them record it, because in those days, and probably still to a degree, producers can kind of very strongly suggest what the artists should record. Certainly it was the case in those days. That was always the way things were done. And for, again, a combination of reasons, though they recorded it, it ended up not coming out and they did their own record instead, Love Me Do. The myth is that it only made number 17 on the British charts. That word only is always used when you read about Love Me Do, as if somehow it wasn't very good. But for a first record, that was very good. And what's more, it hung around on the charts for about 3 months. So that by the time their second record, Please Please Me, came out, they were still on the charts with the first one. And that was already enough to gain them a lot of notice.
Yeah, it was quite a slow burner, wasn't it, Love Me Do? It didn't make the splash, and they had enormous trouble. They went to London, and you outlay clearly how much trouble they had, because they were from Liverpool, and there's this real schism between London and Liverpool that becomes apparent there.
Yeah, there's always been a north-south divide in England, and in particular a kind of anti-Liverpool thing that has been prevalent for a long, long time. And when the Beatles went to London for the first time for promotion, not to record, but to go around and meet journalists and try and introduce themselves to people, get themselves noticed, in other words, get themselves publicity, they had a hell of a couple of days. No one really wanted to know. People were openly rude to them. And yet, you see, a year later, they are the kings of the scene. They are cock of the walk in London, and everyone is opening every door for them, whether they want it or not. And that is incredible. How did they do that in just a year? And this is what we're going to be reading about in Volume 2.
You're underway on Volume 2, Mark, are you?
Quite a bit of the research is done, but none of the writing yet. It is going to be a while. The whole purpose of this project is to get it right, or to really, really try to get it right once and for all, and to put the excitement back in that it always had, but has kind of been squashed flat through being told too often, too badly. So by definition, these books can't be done quickly. That would be self-defeating. So it's going to be, as I say, 6-7 years before it's ready, but I am working on it, yeah.
And I notice in the back of this book, Tune In, that you ask people if they have Beatles stories, memories to possibly get in touch with you. The Beatles came here in 1964. Ringo, I think, was late coming here because he was sick, continuing that story. So that will be part of the next book, their tour here?
Oh, very much so, yeah. The Beatles Down Under, which, as you say, is 50 years ago next June, July. What a tour that was. I mean, probably it was the apex of Beatlemania. The biggest crowds, the most incredible receptions, and from the Beatles' own point of view, really quite an experience. America was all that, but in a kind of frightening way. Australia, they just seemed to, and New Zealand, they seemed to have really enjoyed. New Zealand was a little bit like England on a Sunday for the Beatles in those days. And England on a Sunday was not the most exciting place, and they knew well about that, having grown up in it. But Australia and New Zealand, to a degree, these were great, great experiences for the Beatles in '64.
And one of the strong elements of Tune In is the fan stories, the first fans who were at the Cavern. Can New Zealand people get in touch with you somehow if they have stories, if they have first-hand accounts of meeting the Beatles, which inevitably would have happened?
Yes, absolutely. The thing about these books is I want to tell the Beatles story from the inside out, in other words, looking at them and how they did everything, but also from the outside in, because they had such an impact on people's lives. And such a lot of people did have the opportunity to meet them and have little extraordinary experiences with them that resonate to this day. And I would like to have that reality. Well, I've got it in volume 1 because the fans in Liverpool and Hamburg, particularly Liverpool, had a great relationship with the Beatles. But I need to continue that in books 2 and 3. Again, I'm not writing about legends so much. I'm just writing about these 4 guys and their little coterie around them who just had the most extraordinary experiences.